Before we begin, a brief note to you, the listener. What you're about to hear is not an attack on technology, and it is not a manifesto against artificial intelligence. It is an investigation. A story about how a set of quiet design decisions made over decades transformed ordinary human expression into industrial raw material. It is about how comments, photos, voices, and habits that once felt fleeting became permanent inputs to machines that now speak back to us. This is not a story about villains hiding in server rooms. It is a story about incentives, infrastructure, and a bargain we entered without realizing its full cost. As you listen, try not to focus only on what companies did, but on how normal it all felt while it was happening. Because this story is not just about systems, it is about us and the world we helped build one post at a time. Settle in, let the history breathe, and listen not just for what happened, but for what it changed. In the beginning, the internet did not remember you in the way it remembers you now. It remembered in fragments, like a town that keeps old posters in a drawer, not like a city that records every footstep. You arrived through a narrow pipe, you spoke, you left, and your words lived in places you rarely saw. A message board hosted by a hobbyist, a university server that might be wiped when a grant ended, a mailing list archived in plain text that no one read unless they were looking for it. The web felt like weather. It moved through you. It did not build a portrait of you. You could still believe that what you said online was a kind of conversation, not a kind of extraction. The prevailing mood was improvisation. People made pages the way they made zines. People argued the way they argued in crowded rooms, half serious and half performative. The infrastructure was clumsy enough that it seemed incapable of watching you with intention. Even when the words persisted, it did not feel like permanence. It felt like residue. Then storage got cheaper, bandwidth got wider, and a subtle psychological transformation took place. The web stopped being a place you visited and became a place you inhabited. You stopped showing up occasionally and started being continuously present. Logging on replaced dialing in, and that one phrase contains the whole shift. Dialing in implies a call, a session, a beginning and an end. Logging on implies identity. It implies continuity. It implies that the system knows you well enough to greet you. And once identity became the organizing principle, memory became a product feature. Not memory as in wisdom, but memory as in retention. The ability to call back what you said. The ability to pull up your past and display it. This was sold as convenience, as nostalgia, as connection. Your old photos, your old posts, your old friends. A machine that never forgets, offered as a gift. But memory in software is never neutral. Memory is a lever. If a platform can remember you, it can shape you. It can sort what you see. It can reward what you do. It can learn what draws you forward and what makes you leave. For a long time, we described that learning in the language of advertising. You are tracked so you can be targeted. Your preferences are captured so you can be marketed to. That was already unsettling, but it was familiar. It felt like a louder version of an old bargain. Free services for attention. Free tools for exposure. The underlying assumption was that the platform was reading you only as a consumer. It wanted to know what you might buy. It wanted to know what you might click. It wanted to keep you in the room. That is a form of power, and it shaped the modern world. But it still positioned you as a user in a straightforward way. You were being influenced, yes. But you were still the one being addressed. The system existed to act on you. The training economy changes that posture. It moves the center of gravity. The most important thing about you is no longer what you will purchase or what you will click. The most important thing about you is that you are human, and human activity is scarce. Not your money, your mind, not your attention, your language, not your consumer profile, your patterns of thought and expression. This is the part that feels like a category error until you recognize the scale. A single person's writing is not that valuable. A single comment is a drop. But billions of drops become an ocean, and once you have an ocean, you can do things you could never do with a bucket. You can train systems that predict how humans speak. You can train systems that mimic the structure of our reasoning. You can train systems that generate, not just recommend. And that is where the thesis becomes sharp enough to cut. You are not the user. You are the dataset. To understand how this became normal, you have to go back to the moment the internet learned how to measure reaction. Early online cultures certainly had feedback, but it was messy. People replied, people quoted, people wrote paragraphs. You could infer sentiment, but you had to interpret it. Machines were terrible at interpretation. Sarcasm is almost designed to break a literal mind. Context is a swamp. The platforms did not need poetry. They needed signals, something clean, something binary, something that could be tallied without understanding. The invention that changed everything was not a particular model or a particular lab. It was a button. The like button, the upvote, the heart, the star rating collapsed into a single gesture that translated your internal state into a labeled data point. It looked like appreciation. It felt like participation. It was also annotation at planetary scale. User A approves of content B. User A lingers on content C for 4 seconds. User A shares content D with friends. Each gesture is a small, structured fact about preference. Multiply it by millions, then billions, and you have the most valuable thing in machine learning. A dataset that is not merely large, but labeled. A pile of raw text is useful. A pile of text with human reactions attached is gold. We tend to think of labeling as a specialized activity done by people paid to draw boxes around images or classify phrases, and that is part of the story. But the more consequential labeling was the kind we did while living our lives. Every time you pressed like, you told the system what to amplify. Every time you paused, you told it what held you. Every time you clicked away quickly, you told it what failed. The platform became a laboratory where human preference was continuously measured under real conditions, not in surveys or focus groups. And the platform did not need to understand why you liked something. It only needed to know that you did. This is how recommendation systems became the training wheels for generative models. Before a system can produce something humans want, it has to learn what humans want. The critic comes before the artist. The sorting machine comes before the writing machine. The feed is not the end goal. It is the conditioning chamber. This is why the shift from chronological timelines to algorithmic feeds matters more than most people admit. Chronology is human time. It is the simplest and most egalitarian sorting method. Newest first. It does not require a theory of your mind. The moment the feed becomes ranked, the platform must build a model of you. It must guess what you will engage with. It must test those guesses. It must revise. Every scroll becomes an experiment. Every refresh is a new trial. You are not browsing a list anymore. You are being presented with a simulation of what the platform believes will keep you inside. And the platform learns by watching your micro-behaviors, the tiny unconscious tells that reveal more than your deliberate choices ever could. People curate their identities. They lie about taste. They perform. But attention is honest in a brutal way. It is difficult to pretend to stare at something you do not care about. It is difficult to fake a pause. The algorithm watched the truth leak out of you in the spaces between your decision. It is important to linger on a detail that sounds small but is not. The difference between explicit feedback and implicit feedback. Explicit feedback is a like, a rating, a written review. Implicit feedback is the way you move. Hover time, scroll speed, replays. The moment you stop, the moment you speed up, in the old web, your words were what mattered. In the feed era, your body matters. Your finger, your eyes, the rhythms of your consumption. This is a more intimate form of capture because it is harder to control. It turns you into an instrument that can be read, not just a person who can speak. And once you can be read as an instrument, you can be modeled as a pattern. While this was happening in public social spaces, a parallel extraction was developing under the banner of utility. If the feed trained the critic, the utilities trained the senses. The greatest trick in modern infrastructure was giving away tools that were expensive to operate. Free email, free photo storage, free translation, free transcription, free mapping. These services cost money in servers and electricity, and they were offered as gifts. The truth is that they were not gifts. They were investments. They were designed to attract the very material needed to improve the service and build new capabilities. The photo storage service needs photos to improve recognition. The email service needs language to improve prediction. The translation service needs parallel text to improve mapping between languages. These systems were being built like living organisms, constantly feeding, constantly growing. The price you paid was not in cash. The price was in contribution. One of the clearest examples of this bargain, and one of the most revealing, arrived disguised as security. The old, distorted text boxes that asked you to prove you were human. You squinted, you typed, you moved on. It felt like an annoyance, a tax on access. But the mechanism was elegant, and in hindsight, chilling. If the system already knew one of the words, it could use it as a test. If you passed, it could trust you with a second word that the system did not know. That second word came from a scanned page a machine could not read. By typing it, you were not merely proving humanity. You were teaching a machine to read. Millions of people, 10 seconds at a time, turned the archives of books and newspapers into clean digital text. It was distributed labor without wages, disguised as friction. And then the task evolved. The books were not enough. The machines needed eyes. So the boxes became grids of images, asking you to select traffic lights or crosswalks. You thought you were protecting a website from bots. You were also teaching bots to understand the physical world. You were training the perception layer for systems that would later drive cars and watch streets and interpret images at scale. There is a recurring pattern here, and it matters because it shows the structure of the extraction. First, a service is offered. Second, a human action is required. Third, that action doubles as training data. The service is improved. The loop tightens. The user feels the improvement as convenience and becomes more dependent. The platform or company accumulates not just a user base, but a training base. and the training base becomes a moat. This is why modern business began to talk openly about data moats. It was not merely that data could be monetized through ads, it was that data could be converted into capability. Capability is harder to copy than a web feature. Capability is something you build through accumulation. It is slow and then it is sudden. The moat is not the number of users. The moat is the number of labeled examples of reality that users have unknowingly provided. By the time the term big data became a cultural cliché, the reservoir had already formed. But it is crucial to understand what kind of reservoir it was. In the early years, data was mostly stored and retrieved. Search engines were librarians. They could find what you asked for if it was labeled or linked or written in a way that matched your query. The machine did not understand a sunset. It understood that humans wrote the word sunset near certain images. It understood correlations in metadata. It understood the map, not the territory. That limitation is why the leap to deep learning felt so dramatic. When neural networks began to recognize patterns without explicit labeling, it seemed like the machine was finally looking at the territory. In reality, the machine was still fed by our labels, our reactions, our curation, and our massive archive of examples. We had spent years building a world in which human experience was continuously translated into machine-readable form. The breakthroughs did not arrive in an empty room. They arrived in a room filled with our lives. This is the deeper irony of the modern moment. We often talk about artificial intelligence as if it emerged from research papers alone, as if it was an autonomous scientific miracle. But the true enabling infrastructure was cultural, it was social, it was economic. It was the normalization of constant posting, constant commenting, constant sharing. A machine trained on a tiny dataset is a toy. A machine trained on a decade of global human expression is something else. The models that would later astonish people were built on the quiet labor of billions of individuals who thought they were simply talking to one another. There is a scene, repeated millions of times across the last 20 years, that captures this with painful clarity. A person records a video in their bedroom. Not a professional performance, a confession, a breakdown, a rant, a moment of vulnerability. They upload it. People respond, some with empathy, some with cruelty. The platform sees engagement. The comments become data about how humans respond to grief, shame, excitement, anger. The video becomes data about micro-expressions and vocal tremors. The metadata becomes structured context. You can call it content, but content is too clean a word. It is life turned into training material. The person believes they are speaking into a community. They are also speaking into a future machine that will learn what sorrow sounds like. This is where the metaphor of extraction becomes uncomfortable, because extraction usually implies that something is taken away. If a miner removes ore, the mountain changes. If a thief steals a wallet, you feel it immediately. Data extraction does not create absence. If a company copies your text, you still have your text. If a scraper downloads your image remains on your profile. This is why the act can be framed as harmless. Nothing is missing. No one can point to a hole and say, "This is where my property was removed." But what is taken is context and control. Your words are removed from the moment you intended. Your image is removed from the relationship you implied. The audience changes from a handful of people to an unbounded set of machines and corporations. The meaning changes. You cannot see that shift from the vantage point of your screen. It is happening downstream in pipelines you never visit. Once you accept that, the next shift becomes easier to understand. The industrialization of copying, a comment once posted, is not a singular object living in one place. It is replicated and processed across multiple systems. One copy may go to moderation, another to ranking, another to advertising, another to analytics, and another, crucially, to storage pools meant for future training. This is not a conspiracy. It is an architectural tendency. Data wants to be reused because reuse makes systems more valuable. The same text can serve multiple purposes. The same audio can be transcribed, analyzed, indexed, and later used to improve generation. In the early years, this reuse was mostly about optimizing the platform. In the generative era, it becomes about building the model. When large language models arrived, the change was not that machines suddenly began reading the internet. Machines had been reading in limited ways for years. The change was that reading became compression. The goal was no longer to retrieve your words, but to absorb the patterns in your words. Predict the next token. Learn the structure of language. Learn the rhythms of argument. Learn the shape of explanation. If you train a system on enough text, the system begins to behave as if it understands, because to predict correctly, it must internalize context. This is the strange, almost philosophical twist. Intelligence emerges not from explicit instruction, but from the statistical pressure of prediction at scale. That is why the data needs to be so large and so diverse. It is not enough to read encyclopedias. You need the messy human web. You need forums. You need jokes. You need arguments. You need the mundane. You need the intimate. You need the way people actually speak when they are not being edited. This is why so much training data comes from places where people felt informal, even anonymous. Places where the language is raw, where people speak in slang and sarcasm and shorthand. Corporate writing teaches a machine to be polite. Internet writing teaches a machine to be human. And the most valuable data is often the data posted by people who believed they were safe because they were not attaching their real name. The machine does not care about your name. It cares about the authenticity of the utterance. A throwaway confession on a forum is a pure sample of how humans express guilt, desire, fear. It is a better training example than a polished essay designed for public consumption. The places that felt most hidden became some of the richest minds. When the public encountered a conversational model that could write fluidly, the first reaction was awe, followed quickly by a kind of vertigo. It feels like speaking to something that knows the shape of your world. It produces sentences that resemble the ones you have read all your life. It speaks in a tone that feels familiar. The simplest explanation is that it learned from the internet, and you are on the internet, so it learned from you. But that is almost too abstract for the emotional reaction people had. The real shock came when individuals recognized fragments of themselves in the output. A metaphor that felt stolen, a phrasing that felt personal, a style that felt too close. Sometimes it was direct memorization, an accidental regurgitation. More often, it was something subtler. Not the exact sentence, but the same cadence, the same move, the same rhetorical fingerprint. And that is harder to contest legally, but it is not harder to feel. The sensation is not simply that the machine learned language. The sensation is that the machine learned you. At the same time, a quieter layer of training was unfolding in plain sight. The feedback buttons, the regenerations, the corrections. The casual human tendency to teach things that respond. When a system produces an answer and you correct it, you are participating in alignment. When you choose one output over another, you are providing preference data. The act feels like usage. It is also labor. Not in a moralizing sense, but in a structural sense. The system improves because you are in the loop. The line between user and trainer collapses. This is one of the most perverse inversions of the modern subscription economy. People pay to access tools that are improved by their own activity. You are paying to be inside the training pipeline. It is not a scam in the obvious sense. You receive value, but you also donate value. And the donation flows upward into models that will be sold broadly, sometimes to people who will use them to compete with you. The story becomes even sharper when you look at the older knowledge hubs of the internet, places built on human contribution, programming forums, Q&A sites, community documentation. These were social technologies disguised as reference books. They worked because people enjoyed helping, or enjoyed displaying expertise, or enjoyed participating in a tribe. Those contributions became some of the most useful training material for code generation and technical explanation. Then the loop closes. Once the model can answer quickly, fewer people post. The community thins. The training source begins to dry up. The web, in a subtle way, begins to eat its own seed corn. People call this the freshness problem, or data exhaustion, or the shrinking open web. But beneath the technical terms is a cultural change. The collective project of humans explaining things to each other is being replaced by humans asking a machine trained on those explanations. The machine becomes the middleman, and the original commons begins to decay. This creates the paradox of the generative era. The systems need human output to improve, but the systems also reduce the incentives for humans to produce publicly. If everything you post can be scraped and used to train a model that will compete with you, why post? If your art will become style fuel, why share? If your writing will be absorbed into a voice that can mimic you, why publish? Some people keep posting because they cannot stop, because sharing is social, because the habit is deep. But others retreat. They move to private chats, closed servers, small communities. The public web becomes noisier, more synthetic, more optimized. And in that noise, the value of genuine human text rises. Authenticity becomes scarce, and scarcity creates markets. This is a point where the story shifts from a cultural phenomenon to an economic one. Data becomes an asset class, not in the metaphorical way people said it for years, but in contracts, in licensing deals, in boardroom slides that treat human expression as inventory. Platforms that once positioned themselves as neutral hosts begin to behave like owners of a supply chain. They restrict access. They charge for APIs. They negotiate exclusive arrangements. It is tempting to frame this as platforms protecting users, but the incentives are clearer when you follow the money. They are protecting the value of the corpus. They are protecting the right to sell access to it. If the open web was a gold rush, the new web is a set of fenced claims. Not fences to keep people out, but fences to control who can mine. The deals matter because they reveal what the platforms think they have. When a community site signs a multi-million-dollar agreement to provide data access to a major AI player, the subtext is brutal. The users are not being compensated. The users are not being asked. The platform assumes it holds the rights through terms of service that most people never read and could not realistically negotiate. It is not that the platform believes it owns your soul. It believes it owns a license to your words. And the difference may matter in court, but it feels the same when you watch your contributions become a commodity you never consented to sell. Consent is the word that always arrives at this point, and it arrives wearing a costume. The costume is process, forms, settings, menus, toggles, help center articles, legal phrasing about legitimate interest and product improvement. This is where the story becomes not just about technology, but about bureaucracy as a strategy. When backlash rises, the extraction does not stop. It becomes procedural. It becomes something you can theoretically object to if you have enough time, enough literacy, enough persistence, and enough jurisdictional protection. This is why the ability to opt out often depends on geography. Some regions have stronger regulatory frameworks that force companies to offer more explicit choices. Other regions treat data as fair game. The result is a fractured internet where the same platform behaves differently depending on where you live. Not because it respects your culture, but because it respects legal risks. The most cynical part of this is the reliance on default settings. Defaults are a form of power. A toggle turned on by default is a bet that most people will never change it. People are busy. They are tired. They are overwhelmed by settings across dozens of services. The company knows this. The company designs for this. It is not required to coerce you when inertia will do the work. Silence becomes consent through exhaustion. The user does not actively agree to be training material. They fail to fight their way through the maze. That failure is interpreted as permission. And even when you opt out, there are caveats. You may prevent your own post from being used, but you cannot prevent other people from posting about you. A photo can include you. A mention can include you. A quote can include you. Your presence in the network means your data leaks through other people's choices. This is the hidden trap of social graphs. Privacy is no longer an individual choice. It is a collective property. Your ability to control your data depends on the behavior of everyone around you. The platform benefits from this because it means the dataset is resilient. It cannot be fully withdrawn. There is always another copy, another mention, another tag. The network effect that once made social media powerful becomes a mechanism of CAPTCHA. At this point, the story could remain in text, and it would still be significant. But the shift to multimedia is what turns unease into something closer to dread. Text is intimate, but it is also abstract. A model that writes like you can feel violating, but it is still a matter of words. When models begin to learn from video and voice, the extraction touches the body. The training material becomes your face, your cadence, your micro-expressions, your movement. And here the scale of public repositories becomes decisive. The largest archive of human speech and motion is not owned by film studios. It is owned by platforms built on user uploads, tutorials, vlogs, reaction videos, podcasts, live streams. Hours and hours of people speaking into microphones under consistent lighting with clear audio offering their personality as content. It is a gold mine for systems that want to learn how humans move through time. The extraction here is often justified by accessibility, transcription, captions, searchability. These are real benefits. They also create structured text aligned to video, which is exactly what a multimodal model needs. When you caption a video, you turn speech into tokens. When you auto-generate captions, you create a dataset linking sounds to words. When you align those words to frames, you teach a system not only what is said, but when it is said, and what the speaker's face is doing while saying it. This is not merely about language. It is about performance. It is about the embodied dimension of communication that makes us trust, laugh, fear, empathize. A machine trained on enough of this can begin to generate the illusion of a person. And that illusion becomes a product. The horror stories write themselves here, but the subtler truth is more disturbing. The system does not have to reproduce you exactly to use you. It can absorb your uniqueness as a statistical influence. It can learn the general structure of a heartfelt apology. It can learn the rhythm of a joke landing. It can learn the cadence of a tutorial voice. It can learn the pacing of a reaction shot. It can learn the way human hands manipulate objects. If you have ever watched a how-to video and thought it was just a helpful moment, imagine it as physics training, cloth folding, liquid pouring, light reflecting. This is not science fiction. This is the kind of data a model needs to simulate the world. And the world has already been filmed by us for free at scale for years. Now bring in the psychological shock of deletion. We have been trained to believe that deleting content removes it. We know the internet is forever in a rhetorical way, but we still rely on the idea that we can retract, that a private setting means private, that a draft is not part of the world. But in an environment where scrapers roam and caches persist and datasets are compiled downstream, deletion is often too late. A video can be removed from a dashboard and still live in a training corpus assembled months earlier. A post can be taken down and still exist in a crawl snapshot. The user feels relief at deletion. The dataset does not. The dataset is indifferent. It is built to retain. Why the cultural meaning of public speech changes under the pressure of training. Public speech used to mean that other people might hear you. Now it means that machines may ingest you. The audience is no longer simply human. The risk is no longer simply reputation. It is replication. A sentence can be used not to quote you, but to simulate you. A voice sample can be used not to share your words, but to produce new words in your tone. That transition is subtle until it touches you personally. A scam call that sounds like a family member. A synthetic advertisement that uses a familiar cadence. A corporate training video that features an avatar that feels too close to a real person. Even when the direct link is impossible to prove, the overall atmosphere changes. People become wary of being recorded at all because recording is no longer just memory. Recording is raw material. In response, the culture tries to build defenses. Watermarks, do not train tags, tools designed to confuse models, adversarial noise, the attempt to poison the well. These are acts of protest, but they also reveal despair. They are the tools of people who do not believe the system will protect them, so they try to sabotage extraction at the technical level. The arms race begins, scrapers evolve, models learn to ignore watermarks, platforms offer badges that have no enforcement. The average person cannot fight a pipeline with a caption, and so the burden shifts back to law, policy, and economics. Who owns the right to human expression? Who can license it? Who can object? Who can profit? This is where the story becomes, at its core, a story about infrastructure. The internet was built as a copying machine. That was its miracle. Copying created resilience. Copying created distribution. Copying created the sense that knowledge could spread freely. But the same copying capacity becomes extraction capacity when paired with machine learning. What was once a utopian feature becomes a mechanism of enclosure. The public web becomes a quarry. The platforms become gatekeepers. The AI companies become refineries, and the individual becomes a resource node in a system they cannot see. In the early era, when someone said the internet was like a library, it sounded noble. The dream was that we were building a collective record of human knowledge. But libraries have librarians, ethics, rules, and a sense of stewardship. The modern data pipeline is closer to a landfill being mined for scrap metal, except the scrap is your personality, your jokes, your arguments, your advice, your mistakes, your tenderness. The model does not care that you wrote something in grief. It cares that grief has a syntax. It does not care that you were ashamed. It cares that shame has predictable phrases. This is how the model learns empathy without feeling it. It learns the shape of our interior lives by mapping their outward expressions. At the center of this story is a question that sounds simple and turns out to be nearly impossible to answer cleanly. What does consent mean when participation is the default condition of modern life? When socializing requires platforms? When work requires suites that transcribe and summarize? When education requires systems that monitor and analyze? If you want to function, you must leave traces. Those traces are valuable. The companies argue that using them improves services. They argue that public data is public. They argue that it is transformative, that it is learning and not copying. Critics argue that it is exploitation, that it is appropriation, that it is a new kind of enclosure of the commons. Both sides can produce arguments, and courts will decide some of them. But the cultural reality is already here. The average person feels the shift as a loss of intimacy, a loss of boundary, a sense that the machine is always present as a listener, even when you are speaking to friends. And yet the story is not simply dystopian, because the same tools can be genuinely useful. AI systems can translate across languages and widen access. They can assist disabled users. They can summarize dense information. They can help people learn. The problem is not that machines can help. The problem is the asymmetry. Who benefits? Who controls? Who is compensated? Who can refuse? The training economy, as it currently functions, concentrates value upward. Individuals contribute passively. Corporations extract and monetize. Users are offered convenience and occasionally the illusion of choice. The language of empowerment is used to describe systems built on capture. To see the asymmetry clearly, imagine a stock ticker that does not display company symbols, but displays human actions. A comment is a fractional asset. A photo is a fractional asset. A minute of voice is a fractional asset. Each trade is tiny. No one would notice if they were paid, but at scale, it becomes enormous. This is what financialization means here. The conversion of lived experience into units that can be traded, licensed, and sold. The system does not need to charge you directly for your data. It can monetize the capabilities built from aggregated data. It can sell access to models. It can sell enterprise integrations. It can sell synthetic media tools. The original contributors do not see a cut, because the contribution was never framed as labor. It was framed as life. This is why the phrase "you were not the user" lands with such force. The user is the one a system is built for. The dataset is what a system is built from. In the early internet, you felt like the user. The websites existed to serve you content. The forums existed to host your conversations. The tools existed to help you communicate. In the training economy, the direction reverses. Your presence exists to feed the system. The system exists to grow. You are allowed to use it, but your usage is also fuel. That is not an accident. That is the architecture. There is a final turning point that many people have not yet fully metabolized. The possibility that human expression becomes premium. In a world flooded with synthetic text and synthetic images, authenticity becomes a scarce commodity. Scarcity invites verification. Verification invites gatekeeping. You can imagine a near future where human-only communities charge membership and verify identity, not to exclude, but to preserve value. You can imagine platforms labeling content as certified human. You can imagine people being paid to produce training data explicitly, like a new kind of labor market for genuine speech. This sounds like a restoration of fairness, but it also sounds like a tragedy. It suggests that the public web, once a commons, becomes an industrial zone, and the humans retreat to private gardens behind paywalls. The price of being real becomes a subscription. The casual, generous culture of people helping strangers becomes a luxury item. And if that happens, ask what it means for the next generation. They will inherit a web where the open spaces are dominated by automation, where the loudest voices are optimized, where sincerity is risky because it can be harvested. They will grow up treating public speech as raw material that someone else owns. They will learn to be careful in ways we were not, and some part of the cultural spontaneity that shaped the early web will disappear. Not because people stop being human, but because humans learn that being human in public is a resource extraction event. The internet began with the romance of connection. It promised that distance could be collapsed, that knowledge could flow, that communities could form around ideas rather than geography. That romance was real. It changed lives. It created movements. It created art forms. It created friendships. And then quietly, it created a training corpus. A memory infrastructure so vast that it could be turned into an engine for prediction. The same archive that held our jokes and arguments could be compressed into models that speak. The same platform features that made us feel seen could be repurposed to make us legible to machines. The same convenience that kept us logging on could be used to keep us contributing. In that sense, the story is not about a single villain. It is about a system that discovered what it could do with what we were already doing. There is a moment that captures the emotional end state of the story. A person stares at a comment box. The cursor blinks. The prompt is simple. Write a comment. Share your thoughts. In the old web, that blinking cursor felt like an invitation. Speak, and someone will answer. In the training economy, the cursor blinks like a scanner light. Speak, and you will be absorbed. The person begins a sentence, then deletes it. Begins again, then deletes it. Not because they have nothing to say, but because they suddenly feel the audience is not who they thought it was. They put the phone down. The screen goes dark, and in the black glass they see their face, uncaptioned, untagged, unprocessed. For a brief second, there is a silence that feels almost ancient. A private moment, not because no one could ever know it, but because it is not being offered. That is the question we are left with. Not simply what the law will decide, or which settings you can change, or which companies will win the data deals. The question is, what kind of culture can survive when its default infrastructure treats speech as extractable material? Can a public commons exist when the commons is mined? Can participation remain joyful when participation is also training? Can we build systems that help without consuming? Can we create a future where the benefits of these models are real, but the bargain is honest, where contribution is compensated, or at least meaningfully chosen, where privacy is not a hobby, where the right to remain human is not something you must request through a buried form? If this story has a lesson, it is not that you should never post again. It is not that technology is evil. It is that the invisible becomes normal until it is named. The pipeline is powerful because it is quiet. It runs behind interfaces that feel personal and harmless. It turns your life into a pattern and calls it improvement. Naming it does not stop it, but it breaks the spell. Once you see the extraction as infrastructure, you can demand different infrastructure. You can support platforms that treat users as users. You can demand laws that treat data as more than debris. You can choose to speak in places that respect boundaries. And you can remember that the internet did not start as a factory. It was built as a conversation. The next time you type into a box, pause long enough to feel what is being asked of you. Not just your opinion, but your shape. Not just your reaction, but your training value. Ask who benefits downstream. Ask what you are giving away, even when nothing is taken from your screen. And if you decide to speak anyway, speak with intention. The system was built to extract without asking. The only meaningful counterweight is a culture that learns to ask back. If you want more investigations like this, follow the channel, share this episode with someone who still believes delete means gone, and leave a comment that says what you think the internet should owe the people who built it. And before we end, a final thought for you, the listener. The internet is still being written, not in code alone, but in choices. In what we share, where we share it, and what we accept as normal. You cannot opt out of the past, and you cannot untrain the machines that already exist. But you can decide how much of yourself you give to the next version of the web. You can support spaces that treat human expression as something more than fuel. You can question defaults, challenge silence disguised as consent, and talk openly about what fair participation should look like in an age of intelligent systems. If this story made you pause before posting, that pause matters. If it made you rethink who benefits from your voice, that awareness matters. And if you believe these conversations should be louder, share this episode, subscribe for future investigations, and leave a comment describing what you think the internet should owe the people who gave it their lives, their words, and their time.